Today we're going to have a question that has been submitted to us. We periodically stop and do question and answer. And so today we're going to have a question. And the question is this: is there any historical corroboration for the events that are recorded in the Bible for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Joshua, and people of this period? So that's the question. And before I start, I want to compliment whoever sent this in, which was they're asking for corroboration, which is one of the things that I find is a very good way of putting it, which is history is done by corroborating evidence. It's not really the same as kind of a math formula or tabletop experiment. But Steve, is there historical corroboration for the events that are recorded? The Pentateuch is the first 5 books, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then the 6th one is Joshua. So that period of time deals with those names we mentioned, Abraham through Joshua. Thoughts on that before we jump into details?
Yeah, just as a general sense, there are archaeological evidences. They're meaning that there's hieroglyphics from Egypt that are left behind. There are places that are named in Scripture at this time that have been excavated and they're right where Scripture describes that they should be, which gives some corroboration. We might talk about some of them in specifics as we go through this session. I do want to point out, though, what time frame are we talking about? We're talking about, 2000 BC or before? That's a long time for corroboration. So generally, the items of records that were written on don't exist because they're long gone now. Even in today's time where we have digital devices, CDs, DVDs, even those are going to degrade. You're talking about thousands of years. So there's a lot of evidence that has gone back to dust. But I do think that there's enough things out there that can corroborate these stories through archaeological finds.
And I would agree. And we're going to give some of those today. And because that's what the questioner had was, give me some details of corroborating evidence. Before I do that, I want to make a point here because sometimes people take this wrongly. Is because the books we have that are being talked about, we do have some corroborating evidence. We have some. And because what we do have does corroborate these books, and there's no significant historical corroboration out there that denies it or goes against or contradicts these books, then we have no reasonable evidence to show that we can distrust these books. You understand what I'm saying? What we do have corroborates it, and we don't have anything that significantly disagrees. Therefore, we really don't have a case for anybody to say, oh, well, it's not historically accurate. There's no real evidence. You'd have to have a series of items that significantly went up against these. And there's some things that the historians disagree on, like the exact year that Jericho fell. There's some disagreements on these things, but I wouldn't call those significant. There was still a Jericho. It did fall and things like that. Next, before we get into corroborating evidence, history is not done like a math formula or a tabletop experiment. A math formula, you could sit and prove it and come to logical conclusions with that. Or you can do an experiment and come to a conclusion and then repeat it again tomorrow and the next day. And the lab down the street can do it again and they can do it over and over and see if it's repeatable. Well, history is not like that. History is very different than that. History is just done with bits of evidence. We have a piece of stone here. You may have a testimony there. So then you weigh this evidence, and it's always a judgment call. It's always a judgment call of, is it reasonable? And so some people can take that judgment call and raise the bar so high to say, oh, I never see enough corroborating evidence to believe anything in the Bible, so I'm not going to follow it. Other people could have just the exact opposite problem. They could lower the bar so low that they'll believe anything that comes along. So the trick of reasoning through these things, as far as historical corroboration, which was the evidence, is weighing the evidence against what we would normally see and coming to a conclusion. And one of the first things is what you just pointed out, Steve, is things that happened yesterday, there's going to be a lot more corroborating evidence, and things after the printing press will have a lot more corroborating evidence than things before the printing press. And we're going way back before the printing press. So really the question ought to be, is there any more, or one way you might phrase it is, how does the corroboration for things on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's day compare to other historical events that happen in the same time period? And is it reasonable to conclude that these actually happen?
Can I also mention, you said that there's people that raise the bar so high that it doesn't matter what is there that they won't. Just because people like that raise the question or skeptical of it and say, oh, I don't believe it, and they might give a couple of reasons why, that doesn't give any credence that it didn't happen. An example of that is that less than 100 years from where we're talking today, there was a great atrocity that happened during World War II called the Holocaust. And in our day, there are people called Holocaust deniers. There's actual film of what happened, of the people that were involved in it, of the places where they were killed and kept and interned. There's a plethora of records that were kept on it. So there's plenty of documentation that it actually happened. But yet there's the people that are on that far scale of what you mentioned that said, oh no, it didn't really happen. So just because people say it didn't happen and give you some reasons, that is also not a reason to not believe. And we see that happen, like I said, have evidence for less than 100 years ago, and we know that it happened.
So once again, just to drive home a point, there's some things in history that just because of the nature of history, the way history works, you can't prove it. For example, let me bring a little bit later one than what the question was. First century New Testament. There was a man in the New Testament named Pontius Pilate that get mentioned. Well, there's some corroborating evidence for Pontius Pilate. The archaeologists found a stone with his name chiseled in it. And then there's a secular Jewish historian named Josephus that mentions Pontius Pilate by name, says he was the Roman governor in that region. And Josephus also says that Pilate would sometimes sit in judgment on things that happen in civil matters. So those are three different corroborating bits that would lend some parallels to what's recorded in the New Testament. But there's nothing that's ever going to be recorded in history that's going to say this 1 5-minute conversation that Pilate had on this one day with this one prisoner, Jesus, actually happened and he said these things. We just can't expect that kind of evidence to be there unless there was somebody else that was standing there listening at the time to write down this 1 5-minute conversation on this one day. We're not going to see that. That evidence just doesn't exist. And the further back you go, the less evidence you're going to see. And the question was pretty far back there. So therefore, if someone desires to be skeptical, there's enough wiggle room for them to do that. The question is it reasonable? And how does it compare to other things that happen in the same similar time period? So with that, there are historical corroborations, namely, and here's where we start giving a list of things that would corroborate what we're talking about. Well, again, this is Iron Age kind of things, 1200 BC and going back even further of Abraham, Isaac. I mean, Moses was 12 to 14. This was hundreds of years prior to that.
Yeah, they were 400 years in captivity before Moses, and so that takes it back into the 6th. So like I'm saying, this is around 2000 BC, roughly.
Right. So this is 2000 BC, long time ago. In Cairo, Egypt, there's the Egyptian Museum. It's the Egyptian equivalent of, in the United States, there's the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. And in London, there's the British Museum. It's the National Museum where the governmental archivists keep the great treasures. So in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there's a stone there called the Merneptah Stele, Merneptah Stele, or the Merneptah stone. And it mentions the name of Israel as being in Canaan at about 1220 BC, because on that stone, it mentions the nations that the Pharaoh had gone down and conquered. So the Merneptah stone corroborates that Israel was a nation in Canaan at roughly 1200, 1220 BC. We also find in Egypt, we have a grand temple that's there called the Temple of Karnak. It's a large complex. I visited this. I saw the Merneptah Stele in the Cairo Museum, and I also saw the Temple of Karnak. And in the Temple of Karnak, there's one of the reliefs there that has the conquest of one of the pharaohs, and it talks about the Pharaoh going and conquering the field of Abram. So we have there one of the Egyptian leaders as conquering a piece of real estate that was named after Abram. So that's another one. And reason these tend to lend some credence there is because, again, Egypt's never been known to be real friendly towards Egypt. So they're not doing things here to lend some corroboration. And it is in line with what we might expect, which was a little bit here and a little bit there. Next on my list, there were some texts that were found, some ancient texts called the Ugaritic text or Ugaritic text, and they corroborate some general practices that we find in the time period out of the Pentateuch. The Mosaic Law is the same time period that the question was asked. For example, there was a practice for when, if a husband and wife are married and the husband dies, then the wife is expected to marry the brother of the deceased husband. And that brother was supposed to raise up children after his deceased brother's name and things like that. You'll find that in the Mosaic Law in the same time period as the question. Well, that practice was corroborated in the Ugaritic text. You're also going to find things like the eldest son getting a larger portion of the inheritance. Baal worship or Baal worship, which was later in the Old Testament, that's corroborated in the Ugaritic text. There's the nomadic lifestyle that we found in the days of Abraham down to Joshua, that people would live in a place until the food runs out and then they pick up and move, and they live in tents and they wandered a lot. So that nomadic lifestyle was corroborated both in the Bible and in the Ugaritic text. We also have next on our list some lines of reasoning from the Pentateuch itself that lend support when compared to external accounts, such as there's a series of names in Genesis of people that lived back in this era, again, 2000 BC, that the style of the names align with the style of the names in that period at that time. Later, when Moses moves to Egypt, well, the style of names to his family change because now they have more Egyptian names. So again, little bits where we have when they're in the early periods, 2000 BC in the land of Canaan, all the names are Canaanite. When they moved to Egypt in 1400 BC, now they have Egyptian names. So these things line up with, again, this is internal evidence, but they line up with what we corroborate externally. Then there's a long list of locations that are mentioned in the Pentateuch that we know line up from secular history. The towns of Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, Dothan, Salem, which is later Jerusalem or Jerusalem, Jericho. These are all places that are mentioned in Genesis and all the way down to Joshua that are lined up with what we know about secular history.
We also talked about the cities on the plain that's mentioned during Lot, one of them being Sodom, another being Gomorrah. There's archaeological evidence of these 5 cities in the area, what that's described in Scripture. And in that story, we went through it when we went through Genesis. In that story of these 5 cities, 2 of the cities to the north are destroyed, 2 of the cities to the south are destroyed, but the city in the center, Zorah, where Lot went as a place of refuge, it's not destroyed. So it's quite a coincidence that you have this description of these cities talked about and how they're destroyed. And now we have actual archaeological evidence that shows that that is the case.
And so these are just things, again, history is done by bits that corroborate. One of the cities, Hebron is a major mention in the Pentateuch. In the Pentateuch plus Joshua, the city of Hebron is mentioned 122 times in those books. And the wall of Hebron is still there today. It's still there. It's in ruins, of course, but it's still there. And it was uncovered in 1999. The archaeologists uncovered it. So these are things that lend credence. When the travels, for example, that are in these, when they go from city to city in sequences, and we know, hey, that would be logical that they traveled from this town to that town. If, on the other hand, the text would have had a sequence that had them jerking back and forth, oh, wait a minute, that don't make sense because the land doesn't make sense. And again, you got to understand, if somebody was inventing this 1,000 years later while they were living in another location, finding maps for a place in that time, which was 1,500 years ago, and I'm going to have people wandering around going from town to town, just knowing the names of the towns, but less in the, as I was walking, what sequence I would have them in. This is difficult to just invent it out of whole cloth, as some people claim the Pentateuch has done. Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham was supposed to come out of Ur of the Chaldees. It's a real historical place that has been dug up. It was located about halfway between Baghdad and the Persian Gulf. There's a ziggurat from there, the stone towers that's still there today from that period. There's a royal cemetery that's still there today in Ur of the Chaldees. So these are just a long series of geographical corroborations. Then we have customs and things that are mentioned in that era and mentioned in this book. For example, the religion in the book of Genesis and in these books follows the patriarch of the family and not the religion of the geographic area. So the families would worship a god, and the deities are not associated with the cities and the towns or the geographic region. So that's one of the, again, unspoken coincidence that it just is in the flavor of the book that comes out in Genesis. The absence of priests in the book of Genesis, the absence of the god Baal or Baal. Baal doesn't come in till like Joshua's time frame, and it's not in Genesis. And that was a widespread in that location in that time. Joseph, remember in Genesis, at the last part of Genesis, Joseph is a prisoner, had been there for years. Suddenly, because he can interpret a dream, he's brought into Pharaoh's court. Well, what does he do? They shave him before he goes in to Pharaoh's court because the Egyptians were shaven. And so there's things like that are just these little bits of clues that line up really well with historical corroboration. Genesis talks about the embalming process that the Egyptians did and actually says how long it would take. I believe it was 40 days that it took to embalm a body. So there's these flavor of these things that just come out through the text as you read through them.
I also want to say that as we're talking about these texts, that there was a community called the Essene community that lived around the Qumran area, which is south of Jerusalem there. And there have been scrolls that have been found. They're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They existed, the Essene community, roughly around 100 BC. And in these scrolls are bits and pieces of the Hebrew scripture, the Pentateuch and other. And in all of those pieces, they're exactly the same as what we have today. And it shows that there wasn't any change between what was recorded, what we have, and at least what they had at the time of 100 BC. Again, most of those are pieces, but there's enough pieces to know that the text was intact. However, the whole book of Isaiah was intact, and that's the same as what we have today. So we at least know that these stories or the text that we have today is something that was existent in 100 BC, attributed to times that had taken place and recorded centuries before.
So we have these historical corroborations, and the original question used a good word. We have enough of these that it lines up really well. And things like when they were in Egypt in Exodus, the deities there, the Egyptian gods mentioned were actual ones that we know of now, that were lost to history for many, many years until uncovered. And so there's these corroborating evidences that are like that lend credence to it. And we don't have an equal number of contradictory historical facts. And so that lends us evidence that the documents are trustworthy. But I want to read a quote from, and I'll give the citation here, but I want to read this quote from a Israeli biblical scholar, or an Israeli scholar that has written on this exact question. And so I'll give the citation here. The book is called The Jewish Past Revisited: Reflections on Modern Jewish Historians. And the author's name is Sarah Japhet, Japhet, who holds a PhD from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And she wrote this: not only the geographical, but also the historical geographical aspect of the biblical stories are confirmed by archaeological surveys and excavations. Sites are found where they are expected to be, and information is confirmed about the various peoples and states that surrounded Israel throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages. Moab, Ammon, Edom, Tyre, and the various Aramean states, Arabs, Philistines, and more all appear at exactly the places and times where the Bible places them, close quote. So don't miss what this author said. She said throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages. Well, that covers about 2,000 years, and it covers the entire period of Abraham down to the highlights of Rome. And so this Jewish scholar is saying that everything we have lines up with what we have in the scriptures. But again, to repeat, we're just not going to have somebody standing there taking notes while Abraham's talking to verify, did he actually say this word on this day? But Steve, I've kept what my strongest evidence for corroborating these things to the last. And to me, what outweighs all of these things is the existence of the Jews. The existence of the Jews. We can point to the Jewish people and say something has their hand on this people group, because you're not going to find a group that is as persecuted as they've been through 4,000 years of history, and they're still walking around today and still in that land. And so, Steve, to me, that's the greatest historical corroboration.
Yeah, how many of those other nations that are mentioned in Scripture that are around there, most of them, if not all of them, are gone, but yet the Jewish people are still here.
Right. So that's our question for today. We'll have other questions and answers. So if you have a question, then we'd love to hear from you. Either submit it online, or we have an email, info, that's INFO, at reasoningthroughthebible.com. Submit your questions and we'll see. We spend most of our energy and time just exegeting the text, so maybe a while before we get around to it. But until then, we trust that God will answer all your questions and solve all your problems.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. May God bless you.